Jesus, I'll never get over the introduction. Anybody who's ever had cancer and beaten it is grateful. It goes with the territory. And that was me in April of 1991. I just finished 13 months of chemo. I went into remission and I just leapt into life. I mean, I wrote a movie with a friend of mine, Rick Podell, and we sold it. I got a job playing a pirate for 6 weeks on Spielberg's Hook, and I put together a one-man show with this friend of mine, Rick Podell, and it was based on my own experiences coming to this country as an immigrant in the 60s as half of a comedy team, and then going into advertising and ending up, in fact, on Broadway in the 80s, actually having a tap dance break. And for an Englishman with no rhythm, that's... And it was a fun show, and I combined it with the story of, you know, battling cancer, and it was good. Lots of laughs, you know. I finish up by going into remission, happy ending. And then a week before we were to open, I was in my doctor's office for a routine checkup, and the guy comes back into the office and he goes, "Look, Nick, I'm sorry, but the cancer's come back." What? "Yeah, you know, Nick, these things happen. You know, it's, look, your best chance now is a bone marrow transplant. That's your only real option." Thanks a lot. Well, I was faced, obviously, with two choices. Either I had to do the show very quickly, or I had to change the ending. And not wanting to lie, I changed the ending, and the show worked fine. And a guy came to see it from Fox Television, a man called Stu Smiley, who naturally enough was in charge of comedy development. And he came to Rick and myself after the show, and he asked us if we would be interested in trying to put together, from the ideas in the show, a sitcom. Well, we're not idiots. A week later, we're in his office pitching a show, which I must say I really kind of liked. This was the premise of the show. There's a guy who hates his life. It's just, I mean, he despises his job. He's just got separated from his wife. He doesn't get on with his children. They don't understand him. His whole life sucks until he gets cancer. And then it turns around for the better. And I thought, what a neat idea. Come on, this really upbeat show with a dark underbelly. And we called it The Terminal Man with a Good Attitude Show. And Stu Smiley laughed through this presentation, and he said things like, "That's it! That television, that's breakthrough television, cutting edge." He only had one note. "Does the guy have to have cancer?" Yes, that's the premise. What did he want? Prickly heat? I mean, you know. Anyhow, he said it would make it hard for him to sell. I told him that was his problem, and I went off to Boston to the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute to begin this transplant. Now, let me fill you in on the theory behind this. What I had was called an autologous bone marrow transplant, which means that they took my bone marrow. After I was in remission, they took my bone marrow out and they clean it the best they can and they freeze it. And then, in the course of 2 days, they gave me as much chemotherapy as I had taken in the previous 2 years. This is then followed by 3 days of total body radiation, which is literally like sitting on a chair in the middle of Chernobyl with no sunscreen. And at this point, you have no immune system left at all. I mean, you have no blood count. Only your pulse identifies you as a human being. If somebody sneezes, we're talking eulogy, all right? It is at that point that they reintroduce these clean bone marrow cells back into your body by means of a blood transfusion, and the cells find their way through your body, back into your bone marrow, and grow an entirely new immune system. It's magic, hopefully. Now, the first part of this procedure is known as the bone marrow harvest. The word harvest is a medical euphemism that allows able-bodied men to take needles the size of meat thermometers and slam them into your back, literally 125 times, and take out a liter of bone marrow, right? And I am waiting literally an hour before this, medical mayhem is about to be performed upon me. And the phone goes, and it's Rick Podell calling from LA to say that Fox Television has okayed us to write the pilot script for the Terminal Man with a Good Attitude show, and they want it by January 15th. This is a real problem. It is now December the 23rd, and on the first week of January is when I'm supposed to have the transplant. So I make a deal with Rick. I say, fly into New York, we'll start writing the day after Christmas, and we'll get as much of it done before I go in for the transplant. He agrees. I go into the harvest, and the next morning, I'm let out of the hospital. I creep out, and my wife is there, and she drives me down to New York so I can spend Christmas with my family. Now, in the 5 hours that it takes us to get from Boston to New York, my temperature goes from normal to 104. So now, instead of going home, I'm thrown into the emergency room of St. Vincent's Hospital down in Greenwich Village with this raging fever. And they immediately get to work to try and get it down, which they do by filling white rubber gloves with ice water and ice, and then placing them on my body. I mean, literally, I've got like one here, one in this armpit, like 3 around my groin. I look as though I'm being molested by Mickey Mouse. And on top of this, it turns out that I have got an infection from the harvest, and this means that they will have to postpone the bone marrow transplant. So now I am stuck in a New York hospital over Christmas, which I have to say gives depressing, entirely new meaning. And I've still got this raging fever, and I wake up the day after Christmas, and there is this dark figure sitting at the bottom of the bed, like, ah! And of course, it's Rick Podell with a goddamn laptop, and he's going, we have got to get the storyline line together, because Fox won't let us write this thing until they've okayed the outline. So we knock out a 2-page story, and we fax it to Puerto Vallarta, where Stu Smiley is on comedy vacation. He faxes back an okay. All this before my temperature has dropped below 102. And then every day, Rick comes into the hospital, and we set up to work. You know, I turn off the phone, I prop myself up in the bed, I'm connected to IVs that are pumping all these drugs into me, and we get to work. And I'm amazed by the honor afforded this routine by the hospital. St. Vincent's at that point was a teaching hospital. So you never got one doctor. You got the main doctor, and then a sort of gaggle of satellite doctors that came with him, you know? So this gang would arrive at the door of my little room, and then they would see us at work, and they'd immediately go, oh, no, it's all right, we'll come back later, it's fine, really, no, keep working. And I'm in bed going, no, help, please. But these guys were way more interested by the fact that we were writing a television show than by the possibility of saving my life. And in the 2.5 weeks that it took to get me out of St. Vincent's, Rick Podell and I actually managed to finish the script for the Terminal Man with a Good Attitude show. And what's more, we did it in a room 12 feet by 10 feet, whose only decoration was a crucifix on the wall. And you know how hard it is to get a laugh out of him. Once I was released from hospital, I still had to take antibiotics for another month because they had to make sure there was no infection. As I explained, in the bone marrow transplant, once you have no immune system, any infection will literally kill you, right like that. That's it, you know. So they have to clean you out altogether. But after a month, when they declared that I was clean, the cancer had come back. So then I had to have more chemo. So I was caught in this medical catch-22 that went on, in fact, until the end of March, when I went back up to Boston for the transplant. What can I tell you about a bone marrow transplant? If you like throwing up, you'd love it. I mean, they pumped these mammoth amounts of chemotherapy into me, and within a half hour, I started to throw up. And I didn't stop throwing up for 35 days. I lost 27 pounds, and towards the end of it, when even to turn my head made me retch, I lost all hope, all optimism. The very spirit that had sustained me for the previous 2 years abandoned me. And I lay there on that bed, curled up in this sort of whimpering fetal ball, totally hairless. Even my eyebrows went. I was bloated, I was swollen, blotched red by the radiation. And I longed for death. I prayed for death to come and end this misery. And the phone went, and it was Rick Bedell from LA, and he said, I have bad news. Really? You have bad news? It turns out that Fox Television had decided not to make the Terminal Man with a Good Attitude show. And the reason they gave was that they couldn't bring themselves to make a comedy about a guy who had cancer. And I went, what? That was the premise. They bought that premise. They paid good money for that premise. And what's more, they forced us into writing it on this insane deadline. They had me writing that fucking script on my deathbed. What are these people doing? Was this some kind of cosmic joke played on comedy writers? I got so fucking mad that I decided against death in favor of revenge. And 5 days later, my blood count had shot up, and a week later, I was out of hospital. Who knew? Revenge, the great healer. And that was 20 years ago, and I'm still here. And as mad as I am, and still am in a way at those guys, I gotta tell you that every time I see that Fox TV logo, I get a twinge of gratitude. Thanks, guys.